I think we're getting a thumbs up to start. We follow proteins, which was a very busy panel. But I know that there is as much interest in strategic investing in the Middle East and North Africa as there is in proteins, despite this being 2018 and proteins being in great demand as a subject. Thank you, everybody, for being here. I've got a wonderful panel of guests who will be examining the issues at hand for this session and providing some real insight into steer for strategic investing. Over the last 18 months or so, we have seen a number of trends that are nothing short of transformative in the Middle East and wider MENA region, particularly in the Gulf, in an effort to accelerate advancements that diversify away from hydrocarbons, boost the role of the private sector, and create jobs for what are these rapidly growing labour forces. Witness the ambitious Vision 2030 in Saudi Arabia, twinned with the easing fiscal adjustment, massive infrastructure investments such as UAE Expo 2020, investment in entertainment, arts, culture and tourism, clearly key components to transforming these economies and advancing growth. And at the same time, we're seeing the emergence of a very sophisticated, joined up global investor in the likes of Mubadala and PIF, with their investments in tech and innovation across the SoftBank Vision Fund. So sovereign-owned, resolutely commercial in focus, these funds are positioning themselves to accelerate the growth of their countries and economies through their very different and innovative vision. So where are the clear roadmaps that prioritise the necessary reforms to support these innovations? What are the opportunities? Where are the challenges? And what are the risks? His Excellency Yusuf Al-Otaiba is the Ambassador of the United Arab Emirates to the United States of America. He has a deepened bilateral understanding and cooperation across 3 US presidential administrations. Bilateral trade has grown more than 400%, sir, as each country became one of the other's largest sources of direct investment. We'll talk to you about your experience of US-UAE bilateral trade and where you see the pressure points for FDI and US investment in the UAE and the wider Gulf going forward, given the changes to the nature of these economies. Howard Ford Jr. At the end is Managing Director and Senior Client Relationship Manager across the Institutional Securities Group at Morgan Stanley, Smith Barney and Morgan Stanley Investment Management, working with senior coverage officers to broaden and deepen client relationships. You have, sir, served 5 terms in the US Congress, representing the 9th District of Tennessee. And I hope we'll get from you just a steer as to where things are at with regard the US position in the Middle East. It is a gaping hole to many people's minds when it comes to US policy in the Middle East and where it goes going forward. So we're interested to get your thoughts on that. Mohammed Al-Adi is the Executive Chairman of the global alternative investment firm InvestCore, with huge experience in the region through family business, through tourism and through banking. Mr. Al-Adi's mandate, New Vision, under which InvestCore has doubled its AUM to $23 billion. Huge experience to be had from you. And Joseph Adam Areli is the former Ambassador of the United States to the Kingdom of Bahrain, former Principal Deputy Assistant to the Kingdom of Bahrain. And you have been the founder and principal of the Ibero-American Group, a strategic advisory firm based in Washington, D.C., and Vice Chairman of Mercury Public Affairs between 2013 and 2016. You led the firm's international practice and represented large corporate and sovereign accounts. So fantastic experience across the board. Let me start with you, Ambassador Otaiba, if you will. What is your experience of where the opportunities are along what I'd like you to describe as a clear roadmap for the UAE Vision 2030 in Saudi and the wider space across the GCC at present?
Thank you for having me, and very privileged to be here. I think for us diplomats, we are notorious for taking credit for things we haven't done. And when you talk about the US-UAE relationship from an economic and trade standpoint, most of the people in this room, despite your savviness in the economic and business worlds, most Americans still don't know that the Middle East, that the UAE is America's largest trade partner in the Middle East for 9 years in a row. We have, the US enjoys a trade surplus with the UAE that is the third largest in the world. I think the first two are Hong Kong and the Netherlands, if I'm not mistaken. So the economic relationship from any angle you look at has been an astounding success. We diplomats do what we do best and stay out of the way, and it works really, really well. There's been some really good examples that I think are worthwhile, because if you look at it on their own, NYU Abu Dhabi, Cleveland Clinic, the Louvre, despite that it's being French and not American. If you are running the Louvre or Cleveland Clinic or NYU and you are choosing to go into the Middle East, the UAE is going to be one of the first countries you look at, simply because of what has happened in the UAE in the last 20 years. Because of the rule of law, because of the regulatory system, because of the infrastructure, because of the commercial hub that it's become. There are a lot of attractive reasons that make the UAE seem as a good fit for you, whether you are a university or a hospital or a museum. Now, having said that, it doesn't mean that we stop there. It doesn't mean that we don't talk to the Guggenheims and the Morgan Stanleys. It means that we need to compete with the upcoming Saudi, the new and improved Saudi after the reforms. It's actually more difficult to maintain your lead as a UAE, as a hub, than to challenge for it. So I think our work is cut out for us if the Saudi reform is going to be successful, and I believe it is. But that is a good thing. The more competition we have, it's a good thing. The more we empower youth to privatize and diversify our economy away from hydrocarbons, it's a good thing. So I welcome this competition, and I think this is a good thing for America and the West to have more options in the Middle East as partnerships for partnerships to look at.
Mahmoud, let me just get you, if you will, just to explain what you think ultimately drives Vision 2030 at present, and what Vision 2030 has learnt from the reforms and policies that we've seen from the UAE, for example, over the last 15 to 20 years, and what you think the region can learn from 2030 at this point.
Very good. Well, thank you, Becky. I think the Vision 2030 in Saudi Arabia and the way it's been executed is really a very good example for the whole region. I think first you will see in Saudi that there is leadership from the top for this vision. The Crown Prince himself is owning it. There is an inclusion in it, so it is not just about economics, but it is also about social, about infrastructure. I think it is about getting the human side of it is involved. So I think every change needs good leadership to take it, ownership, and I think it has to be inclusive. And this is what 2030 is really coming to be. So it's changing the economy of Saudi Arabia, but it's also changing the whole life, the business, the ease of business, the work ethics, empowering young people, empowering women, not for cosmetic reasons, but because they are qualified and ready to take those things.
Joseph, your experience of the region was at the sort of beginning to mid part of a series of visions across the region ahead of what we've seen in Saudi. When you assess what you've seen to date and you consider experience from the likes of Singapore and elsewhere, how do you see the current position with regard 2030 within the sort of the wider context of the region?
Well, let me echo something my colleague Yusuf said. Is I'm a diplomat. I'm not a financial guy or an economist. Reading a balance sheet to me is like reading a foreign language. But I've been working in the Middle East for now almost going on 25 years, and it seems that there are a number of trends or broader contextual factors that I think are important to keep in mind. First of all, I would argue that this has gone beyond being an emerging market. I mean, this is a very sophisticated market with very sophisticated people, and therefore with a consequently lower level of risk than other markets. But having said that, it is a region, as you said in your opening remarks, that is rapidly changing. I think that reform, speaking to 2030, reform is real, reform is genuine, and reform will be sustainable. 2030 gets a lot of attention, but I would point out that when I started in Bahrain back in 2007, they had their, what was it called? 2030 plan or 2020 plan, which was the Kingdom of Bahrain's plan to diversify and develop a knowledge economy that was started back in 2005. The UAE has been at this game since 2007. So again, Saudi Arabia is kind of late to the party, really. Now they've made a bigger splash because they're bigger. They are the elephant in the room, if you will, in the region. But let's be clear. This is a systemic process of change that has been underway for some time, and is going to continue. Having said all that, and I don't want to be the skunk at the picnic, but I think there are particularities to this region that any potential investor would do well to bear in mind. And it all boils down to know your customer, and your customer in this case being the people who you're doing business with in the region. Tell me if I'm going too long, because there's a lot I want to say. But if you look at the largest institutional investors in the region over the last 10 years, it seems to me there's a trend developing or a practice developing whereby their investment decisions and where they deploy their money and how they manage their money is not limited to or restricted by pure economic or financial considerations. I wrote an article recently in Foreign Policy that says about the idea of sovereign wealth funds using or countries using sovereign wealth funds as tools of national power. The fact of the matter is politics and national security are driving investment decisions in addition to economic and financial returns. And I ascribe this to a couple of factors, again, that are unique to the region. Number one, the Arab Spring. Let's be clear, that was a wake-up call to every country in the region that if we don't get our house in order and attend to certain fundamental inequalities and obsolescences, we're in big trouble. And I think that's a lot of what's driving 2030, and that's why I think the change is real, because these guys want to survive. And it's not a question of should we or shouldn't we, it's we have to, and we're going to stick with it. And that's really why, at the end of the day, I'm bullish about this market, because they're doing it for the right reasons and they're going to be committed to it. So the Arab Spring really motivated and accelerated some of these changes that might otherwise have been much more gradual and much less deep. Second of all, and you read about it, I mean, in our earlier session today, Yusuf said, we talked all about these issues, and we never mentioned Iran or Syria or Libya. Yes, that's true, but I'm going to do that in the sense that I don't think that Iran, Libya, or Syria are reasons to stay away from the region, or Yemen, whatever. Those aren't reasons to stay away from the region. But they do point to a development in geopolitics, which is the evolution of great power rivalry, and how that is manifested in the region. In the sense that, look, let's be clear, for 8 years under Obama, we, and I'm not Republican or Democrat, but we walked away. And countries like the UAE, countries certainly like Saudi Arabia said, holy, you know what, we better hedge our bets. You know, we can't put all our eggs in the US basket. We've got to develop relationships and friends and leverage with others. And so that is one of, in my mind, and correct me if I'm wrong, one of the factors that is driving some of these sovereign investment decisions. If you look at where they're putting their money, look at who they're partnering with. Russia, for example, China, Asia, you know, and other development projects within the region. That's it's a hedge. The third factor, which frankly I think is one of the most exciting elements in the region, is what I call the rise of the millennials. I'm not going to ask your age, but he's a young guy.
Not a millennial.
He's not a millennial,
Just
but
a lie.
like on the cusp, right? But Mohammed bin Salman's a millennial, right? Tamim bin Hamad is a millennial. Your ruler, Mohammed bin Zayed, acts like a millennial. I mean, he's one of the most out-of-the-box guys you'll ever meet. So, but my point here is millennials do things differently. They think differently. And they are much more into synergies in the sense that they don't approach a development question separate from a national security question or a geopolitical question, but they're all linked. And they use all the tools of their national power, economic, financial, political, social, to advance their national interests. And that is a factor in the topic we're talking about today. So again, what does that all mean for strategic investing? Like I said, it boils down to know your customer. Know who you're dealing with. Know what's motivating them. Know what they want to get out of the project. Know what all the various factors influencing the structure of the deal and the decision-making in the deal and the different authorities involved in the deal are, because I promise you, there's probably more than meets the eye.
Thank you for that. Harold, know your customer, know your friends, know your adversaries, understand your alliances. Understanding the alliance with the US for the region at present is a big sort of elephant in the room to a certain extent. It's very difficult to know for Middle Eastern and North African countries exactly what US policy is at present. And I think for any strategic investor, there will be, even though I think there will be a consideration, but ultimately an investment on the basis of whether they truly believe that these new platforms, these new plans, these new visions are going to work. Clearly, there is a roiling geopolitical situation. Can you give us any insight into what US policy is in the region going forward?
I'll try. I'd say two things. Last night we had a great dinner, and Becky, thank you again, and Guggenheim and KBBO, thank you guys again for having us and me up here. But at the dinner last night, Yusuf said something that I thought was the great answer, a succinct answer to your question. Fran Townsend was there, the former Homeland Security Advisor to President Bush, and Yusuf said that after 9/11, Fran made her way to the region once a quarter. And made clear to our allies and friends in the region that not only was the U.S. an ally, but the U.S. was going to be there, and there was never any doubt. President Obama had a different tact, as the ambassador said, which I happen to agree. I believe with the tone, if not the substance of what you said, that might have been the wrong, certainly not been my way about doing it. And I'm a Democrat, and I say that you ran away from any ideological or partisan makeup on it. So I don't think there's any doubt. Predictability and stability in the region, it only comes about if there's predictability and stability in the relationship as well, and direct American involvement, and sustained American involvement, and understood and consistent involvement. Whatever you want to say about President Trump, and I was not a supporter of his in the primary or the general, I thought he had a pretty good shot at winning, and almost got excommunicated from my family for sharing that opinion at Thanksgiving a year before and Christmas. But having said that, he has brought about a kind of joyful uncertainty as it relates to the way we're handling our not only domestic but our foreign politics. And I think there were a number of Democrats who had great doubt that anything would be accomplished in a significant way between us and North Korea. And there seems to be some movement there that many did not expect. Certainly, some people were not even rooting for it to happen. I think probably the best part of the answer to your question, Becky, is that we now have a new Secretary of State and a new National Security Advisor that President Trump seems to have a lot of confidence and trust in. I watched in one of the breaks today, Secretary Pompeo, who apparently, before he was approved or confirmed for the job, traveled to North Korea and met with Kim Jong-un. But he did something today in his opening. He's not been sworn in yet as Secretary of State, but he held a town hall meeting with all of his colleagues and the employees there. And it was remarked or observed by all of the U.S. commentators watching that this was something that Rex Tillerson, who I think is a decent human being and a decent man, never did. And there's great hope that he enjoys, Secretary Pompeo enjoys the confidence of this president. The new National Security Advisor I disagree with on some of his approaches to things, but he seems to enjoy the confidence of the president, which I'd be curious to hear the ambassador remark about whether you agree or disagree with perhaps some of the words or observations or history of a cabinet member or national security advisor. Is it important that that cabinet member have the confidence of the president? And unfortunately, I think over the last several months, it's hard to believe the president's only been there a year and a couple of months, but since his time as president, President Trump, that there's not been that kind of confidence in his leadership, in those who are representing the U.S. and representing him. Hopefully that changes, because I think that's what will give the confidence that our allies and friends in the region want. And for that matter, I think the very eloquent soliloquy we just heard about why we should be bullish on this region.
Just briefly, and we talked about this again last night. For those who weren't here, it would be useful to get your steer on this. We talked to Fran Townsend last night about how we have seen a move, not a pivot, she said. She didn't call it a pivot, but a move from a concentration on counterinsurgency and terrorism to one of, as you just rightly described, great power competition. I wonder how you think that will inform and impact the Secretary of State's position with regard the region as a whole. Iran potentially being a great power competition, and then a lot of what else is going on in the region being labeled by the US as, to all intents and purposes, counterinsurgency and terrorism. Can you see how that might play out as of yet? This is the new national defense position.
So I would say two things, and I would much rather hear Yusuf's thoughts on this than hear mine. But I would say two things. One, what has been touched on so far, before I get to the core of it. One, you look at the growing population of young people and the high percentage of young people that millennials, as I guess we call them, and I think Yusuf is a very attractive bald-head millennial. So I'm happy that he shaved his head. So I think you look at that aspect. Number two, again, I can't emphasize enough why I think it is important, particularly the president like we have now, who has limited experience and seemingly a limited appetite for wanting to delve deeply into the issues, that you have a group of people around him that can, that allies, and for that matter, even adversaries can say, we can believe and trust in what he, or in this sense, not she, but what he is saying and how America will behave. It's hard to just erase what President Obama did over the last several years and his kind of hands-off approach. I think that the last year we've seen vast improvement in that front, but I don't know how you erase that with just a simple cleaning of the board. You have a reaction to that, Ambassador?
Yeah, I think it's going to take a while to get over that. And I think, to Adam's point, if you are witnessing hedging, it's precisely because of that. It's, wait a minute, if we can't depend on our partner to be there for us, especially a partner that we were there for them so many times, then yes, it would be wise to hedge. Then yes, if I ran a fund and this fund was X, I wouldn't put all of that fund into one stock or to one piece or one sector. I would diversify. That's that's what investors do. It's no different than, you know, how you would manage your relationships with your partners if you start feeling one of your partners, your main partner, might not be there. And then to touch on Harold's point about personnel. Yes, Pompeo is going to come in and I think revive the State Department. John Bolton is going to come in and remake the National Security Council the way...
He's going to do something.
He's going to do something. But also, to be honest, you know, when H.R. McMaster, he came in and put in his staff, I think John Bolton is going to come in and put his staff. Every, you know, senior national security advisor is entitled to do that. But instead of just focusing on one or the other, I'm going to observe how Bolton, Pompeo, and Mattis get along with each other, and the relationship and the dynamic between those three, because I think that's what's really going to influence policy. It's not just one or the other. And so I'm going to observe how those three get along and make decisions as a team, I think.
Well, as we do that, let's pivot back to thoughts on specific investing strategically in the region. Mohammed, Investcorp oftentimes, and certainly your experience has been, providing a bridge between the GCC and the West. You are invested outside of the GCC and you take investment in. So just give us a sense of where you are at present, where you see the strategic opportunities and the undervalued opportunities in region at present.
So thank you. So, you know, for 37 years now, Investcorp has done that, really been a bridge between the wealth of the Gulf and the opportunities in America. Here we bring capital to the United States and we invest it in here. And 7-8 years ago, we started also investing into the Gulf. So I think the opportunity are immense in that part of the world. You know, in infrastructure, it is needed. Healthcare is one of the sectors that are growing more than anywhere in the world because there's so much demand for it. We have a huge young population. If you take the MENA region, there's something like 1.6 billion people. The GDP of the whole MENA region is something around $4.5 trillion. So there is a meaningful, you know, market for it there. And there is need for a lot of things, you know, whether soft in terms of healthcare, education, or hard in, you know, the logistics, the ports, the infrastructure for transporting things. Many of the ports of that region sits on the Indian Ocean, like the Omani ports of Salalah, Duqm, and Sahar. That region is also on the one road, one belt for China. So it's you know, for those who wants you know, to invest in that kind of scheme, there is there. So the opportunities are really, really immense. The governments also, you know, to the discussion that has really been very proactive in making sure, you know, that the regulations are changed and the regulations come to grow the sectors and grow the business as opposed to hinder them. They are privatizing, so they are offloading a lot of the burden from the public to the private, which causes a lot of opportunities. In the next 7 years, there will be $1 trillion in that region spent on petrochemicals, you know, on upgrading the oil and gas, on building refineries. In 5 years' time, I think that region is going to be the hub for refined products in UAE, in Saudi Arabia, in Oman, and in Kuwait, and other places. So the opportunities are really great in that region.
And when you consider Vision 2030 and what's going on in the UAE, for example, and indeed in Oman, I'm wondering where you see arts, entertainment, sport, tourism catalyzing around the opportunities or catalyzing around the the potential for economic advancement. These are key components of these new visions, particularly in Saudi. Where are the opportunities there?
Well, I think the region also is very diverse. I mean, Oman, you go to Oman, for instance, for the nature, for the history. You go to Dubai for really a great shopping experience. But also there is culture. His Excellency talked about the museums. There are, opera houses are being built in the region. You go further, there are diversity in food. There is diversity in climates. So all these things, I think, are being leveraged in producing the diversified economies of the future.
Go on.
You did a fantastic job of covering the opening of the Louvre, which I think will single-handedly be responsible for increasing the tourism numbers of the UAE by about 10%. And without the Louvre, the tourism numbers in the UAE last year were close to 22 million tourists a year. So I think we're going to see close to 24 million this year. So I think that cannot be understated. A country of 10 million people seeing 2.5 times its population in tourism, a country that, unlike Egypt, doesn't have the pyramids or Sphinx or any historical museums until now. In March of 2019, Abu Dhabi will host the Special Olympics. It's never been done before. It's never been done in the Middle East before. We can talk about the economic impacts of these events, the golf tournaments, the tennis tournaments, the horse races, but the social impact, what it means for societies, what it means for people to be able to just get out of their house and go to these events as a normal occurrence is hugely important. And as we talk about transforming the region and social and economic reforms in Saudi Arabia and others, it's important to understand how much that means to young Arabs to be able to go to a Jay-Z or Pink concert in Abu Dhabi or Dubai, or go to the Louvre or an opera in Dubai. It's part of the successful model of the Middle East, part of the Middle East of the future, that it's not just going to be in the UAE anymore.
And that's, Joseph, very important, isn't it?
Well, sure. The interesting thing is that, and one of the great drivers of change, and there's I don't know if it's Samuel Huntington who talked about this, but the crisis of rising expectations, right? If you're aware of what's going on around the world and you have expectations and they're not met, the consequences can be very harsh. Now, let's remember, this is a region that's connected to the rest of the world. Cell phone usage cell phone penetration is more than 1 to 1. I mean, everybody has 2 cell phones, 2 accounts. They're all connected on social media. You could say the same thing. I mean, they're all connected. So they know what's going on.
We millennials are very plugged in.
Yeah, they know what's going on, and they want to go to the party. And if they're not given a seat at the party, they're going to get pretty restless. So it's, again, culture's great. I was the principal deputy assistant secretary for education and cultural affairs at state. I believe in culture. I believe in it for its own value. But there's also a political dimension to this. And if you don't meet people's expectations, you don't give them things to do, there's going to be hell to pay. And this is the big problem this is, again, what differentiates the western side of the Arabian Gulf from the eastern side of the Arabian Gulf. By that I mean Iran. Those guys, they're what, half of their 60% is under the age of 25? And they can't do anything or go anywhere or talk to anybody.
In a few years, Saudi is going to be more progressive than Iran.
I think they already are.
I mean,
I think they already are.
Within.
I mean, they have a woman on the board of Aramco now.
What I think is important, and you point out how important this is politically, but getting back to the young 60% under the age of 30 or 70% under the age of 30, both in Saudi and largely across the region. Many of what we are seeing in these key component sectors for these new visions will be in an effort to provide new jobs for locals. And when I talk about that, I'm talking about across arts, entertainment, sports. I mean, the Qiddiya project in Saudi for Vision 2030 is specifically designed to not only retain some $30 billion spent away from Saudi by young Saudis, but to employ and develop Saudis across a myriad of sectors, which, Mohammed, is important, isn't it? Because when you look to any of these visions, and anybody who's looking for a strategic investment in this region will be investing in this region's future labor force.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And I think, the talk of the Arab Spring, and I think Arab Spring was in the main about young people wanting, what every young man in the world wants. They want jobs, and they want a home, and they want, a hope. And I think the governments have known that this is the future. And hence all this diversification is, the human part of it, the manpower responsibility of it is, I think, is huge. And so, yes, I think anybody investing in that region is investing in the future.
Do you think the plans are specifically ambitious enough in order to meet the human capital demands from expanding these non-oil industries?
I mean, oil and gas will stay very important. And I think, with oil, the experience is beyond 6 months. You never say never, because you don't know what the oil is going to say, despite what people say. So the region, I think, oil and gas is a great guarantee of a sector that will continue. But of course, I mean, I think a lot of the diversification is going into sectors that are manpower intensive in a way, but also with technology is becoming more efficient and becoming more productive.
Harold, I wonder whether you've got comment on how important it is that these visions are successful in binding a region that in the past might have been looked at with sort of fascination and trepidation. We talked about this early on. Whereas in 2018 and beyond, we live in a world which will be bound through mutual alliances so that we're connected in ways whereby people can't just walk away. So the compact, to a certain extent, is changing, isn't it? The compact with the West for the Middle East, which once may have been written along military alliances to all intents and purposes, ought to be redesigned, and through these projects will be redesigned so that the interconnections will be much more difficult to break going forward. Alliances should be written in stone, surely, along economic and sort of fundamental lines.
I worked for a commerce secretary here in the U.S. named Ron Brown, the late Ron Brown, who believed, like some of his predecessors, but he certainly tried to practice this notion of commercial diplomacy, to your point, in building these pacts and organizing them around shared economic and shared job creation interest. You look at the United States for a moment, and you look at the demographics in a lot of urban areas and rural areas that have been hard hit and are trying to find ways in which to bring jobs back and opportunity back. And oftentimes in many of these communities, there's no broadband service. So if you're any size company, it's hard to say I'm going to locate in an area where your employees can't communicate and you can't access the web. I'm particularly interested in hearing the fellow panelists, because I think what you're getting at, Becky, I agree with. I'd love to know in 5 to 10 years, 15 years, as we talk about investment ideas, where the middle class where's the middle class job creation going to be, in what industries? I've heard Yusuf talk eloquently about tourism and infrastructure, but what does that mean tangibly. Now, directly to your point, there are a number of elected officials and young leaders in this country who are growing up who are going to have just a vastly different perspective of this region. And I think Yusuf said it so well last night. Probably the most important, if not one of the two most important things happening is MBS and what he's looking to do and the vision that he has. And I know that it's been commented on it that Saudi Arabia already may be more progressive and open and tolerant than Iran may be. But I think about a group of young people in America who are 10, 11, 12 years old. They're waking up today and they finally have seen their first white president in Donald Trump. They had a black president for 8 years, and if they were 1 or 2 or 3, might have been paid. They're 13, 14 years old. So you have a generation of leaders in this country who are going to grow up and see just a vastly different region than what, I'm only 47, but I entered Congress in 96. And obviously our world changed on September the 11th, and you know, and so remarkably and astonishingly changed the way U.S. politicians think about a region. So, but that cycle is compressed. We're less than 20 years later. We're now talking about not only a different relationship, but even a different relationship within the region amongst the various countries in the region. So I think I'm very, not only bullish on investing, I'm bullish on this new compact and this new relationship that U.S. policymakers will have. And I'm probably most enthusiastic and joyful about it and bullish about it because something you said ended on last night when our conversation last night got a little bearish, and you reminded us all that there's reason to be hopeful here. And I think that there's more than one reason. I think there's several reasons to be hopeful here.
Do you want to take that on? So just mark out where you think we'll be at, and what the region will look like 5 to 10 years on.
If we keep going on the path we're on, I think the policy shifts around the world are going to be less harmful or less of a pendulum swing if we have if our relationship is anchored by a very solid economic and trade relationship and anchored by a very solid and deep military relationship. And then you have the NYUs and the Guggenheims and the various other partnerships that kind of build the people-to-people relationship. I think we will be less immune to policy shifts. When you have a relationship between countries at the human level and at the institutional level, the individual at the White House will matter less. And so I think we've been focused on kind of what our relationship with the administration is, and if it's good, then we're in good shape, but if it's not good, then we suffer, right? There's no risk management to the relationship. And what I think the UAE and the US have gone through in the last 10 years is building up on the various anchors that keep the relationship afloat, no matter what happens at the top of the pyramid.
You think the Saudis have been equally as sophisticated? I just wonder. I mean, given current climate.
On the contrary, I think the Saudis have had a much historical relationship, much stronger with the US than the UAE. I think the history, the 1945 signing, the relationship when Prince Bandar was the ambassador and his relationship with the Bush team, their relationship with the US was much stronger than ours. But it also shows how much their relationship suffered as well, because it wasn't anchored. And so I think things like the Milken conference, where Khalifa and his team can create partnerships with Guggenheim and others, where companies can invest and create win-wins, where Milken finally did the first Middle East conference in Abu Dhabi last February. These things make a huge impact. They really do. And we can disagree on Syria policy, but if all the other stuff is working well, that disagreement has very little bearing on the relationship.
Very good points. Joseph, 5 years out, crystal ball gazing.
Yeah, I would say 5 years is a blink of an eye. And, I'm just reminded of this phrase, the ties that bind, because that's kind of a subtext to what you're doing. And before I talk, how many of you have done business in the Middle East before? Or let me put it another way, how many have not? Okay, so I kind of think we're preaching
Grab that guy.
Yeah, right. Let's talk. No, I mean, I kind of think I just want to make sure we're not preaching to the converted, But again, I think history is so important, and we've talked a lot about history. But let's go back further. And I would argue that, you know, Obama's policies in the region were a problem, but we've had lots of problems, lots of storms between the United States and the region for a long, long time, and we've always been able to get through them. I mean, 9/11 was a real crisis. The oil shock of 73? I mean, that was a real crisis, right? The invasion of Saddam's invasion of Kuwait was a real crisis. The Iraq War, the last one, was a real crisis we've gotten through all of them. Why? Why? Because we have the ties that bind. And those ties go way, way back, right? And they're not government to government ties, they're people to people ties. The American Mission Hospital, founded in Bahrain in 1907 by Mennonite missionaries. There would be the wives of the sheikhs in the region from Kuwait and Saudi Arabia and the UAE who would get on a dhow to give birth in Bahrain by American missionaries, right? Where was the first oil discovery in the Gulf? Anybody can tell me where and when? There you go. And then Standard Oil of California. And then they went to Saudi Arabia and discovered the big field in Saudi Arabia. My point here is that commerce built this relationship. Not the military. Forget about the military. That's a nice insurance policy, but it's not what drives it. What drives it is people helping people to survive and prosper and learn. The other thing, in my view, that has, and again, as an education guy, that has saved our bacon more times than we're willing to admit, is the huge number of Arabs from the region who have studied in the United States. Again, Saud al-Faisal, Turki al-Faisal, Yusuf al-Utaiba, Adel Jubair. They know us. I mean, the foreign minister of Bahrain says he sometimes feels more American than he does Bahraini. He went to Stephen F. Austin,
doesn't matter.
One of these universities in Austin, not University of Texas. But they're almost as American as Americans. And again, when you have to communicate, when you have to deal with problems, it helps to deal with somebody who understands you. And they understand us way better than we understand them. Now, let me bring it around to investing, okay? This, to me, is the key of a successful investment strategy for the region, for outside investment in the region. And it's the fundamentals. It is be an informed and involved investor. This should not be a transactional exchange. Just what do I have to do? Put my money, wait for it to mature, and then exit. No, you have to contribute. You have to, the hunger in the region, and it's not technology that drives change and progress, it's people who drive change and progress. So it's not about creating incubators and stuff. It's about teaching people and helping people develop their own know-how and their own human capital. So if you're investing in the region, do it for the long term and contribute to the societies where you are or where you are investing. Bring people from those countries to your companies to do internships, to do training, to work for a year or 2 years so that they can go back and replicate what they learned here. Or not just replicate, but apply it in in an organic way in their own societies.
Let me just put this to thank you, and those partnerships work very, very well. But you know, I would hate for people to believe that still there was no know-how. That knowledge economy is growing significantly and is sophisticated in these regions. But you're right to point that out. Can you just, Mohammed, for us, to a certain extent, speak to what Harold was discussing, which is what will these societies look like in 5-10 years' time? When you consider who the consumer will be for any big company that anybody might strategically invest in the region. Who will the client be? What will these societies look like?
Well, I think, I think across that region, the governments are really laying all the conditions for investors, like the American investors, to come there and invest in good sectors, growing with good returns. And I think so that means you're having societies that are good for doing business, that are interacting with the outside world, that are tolerant, that understand, like the ambassador said, the Western standards and procedures. And I think it's the trade globally. I mean, I think in 5 years' time, you want a healthcare system that is helped by the United States in bringing it up, by upgrading it. You want an education system that is, speaks to the education system in the United States. You want a venture capital systems that benefit from what's happening in the United States, from universities all the way to the likes of Google and Twitter and everything. So I think the whole region really looks to the United States as an example and as a good example to follow. And therefore I think it's also, I would like to say to our American friends, is that it is your responsibility to reciprocate this by coming to that region and helping that region connect with the United States.
To Harold's point, there is a burgeoning middle class. I mean, there's a kind of change in the demographics to a certain extent, which, as you rightly point out, speaks to the need for an enormous amount of investment in healthcare, in education, in those kind of softer areas that away from sort of logistics and the sort of classic industries that Dubai might have been built on. We've got a burgeoning middle class in the region which needs feeding, watering, and looking after and entertaining going forward. Questions from the audience, if you will. Yes, sir.
You've this is a question for the ambassador. You talked about the significant role of culture in developing the region. The 2007 vision for Abu Dhabi and Saadiyat Island envisaged 4 major cultural complexes. One has been built and is hugely successful.
Yes.
The chatter in the art world has been, in fact, that the other projects are sort of running out of steam. Are we going to see those rebooted? And how much does the fact that America doesn't have a Department of Culture and Tourism helping to steer through a project like the Guggenheim slow down or impact this development?
It doesn't at all, because we're actually in talks with Guggenheim right now, but the negotiations are basically over resizing the original scope of the museum. So we want to cut the original size and plan from Frank Gehry by 10%. So we're negotiating with Frank Gehry whether he wants to change his original design, and an 83-year-old world-famous architect doesn't like these types of negotiations, so it's going a little slower than we'd like. But the plan is still, the original plan is we're going to build all 4 at the same time until we realize how much that's going to cost. Then the plan became, okay, we're going to build them gradually. The next museum that will be announced, and I believe it's going to be announced sometime in the next quarter, maybe 2 quarters from now, is the National Museum, the Sheikh Zayed Museum. It'll be announced soon, and that should be completed probably within the next 3 years. The next one after that will be the Guggenheim, if we can reach a conclusion. So the original plan is still that we will build 3, maybe 4 facilities gradually. So I know the next 2 steps, we're just waiting for timing.
Yes, sir. Yeah, and then you, sir.
So this is also sort of for the ambassador, but also panel at large. How do you see sort of entrepreneurship, especially around information technology, emerging in the region, especially GCC? We're seeing sort of, as you mentioned, the burgeoning middle class that is very worldly and educated in the West, where we're seeing sort of startups in Bay Area and here. How do you see those forming, Because it's not like there's a lack of capital. And do you see sort of entitlements holding back some of the entrepreneurship in the Middle East?
That's a very good question. The short answer is no. Actually, I see more young people focused and driven to innovation than I've ever seen. Not just from the Emirates. I see Egyptians, Syrians, Palestinians, Lebanese, you name it. They're flocking to Abu Dhabi and Dubai because that's where the talent is and because that's where it's easier to set up business. There's a story I like to tell, which is there was an Egyptian gentleman who said, I'm going to go do my startup in Dubai. Somebody said, well, why Dubai? He said, it's the only place I can do a startup without having to pay a bribe. and so this is happening because it's easy to go set up shop. What I think will help us speed up building up this ecosystem is reforming our regulatory system and our bankruptcy laws and the part of our society that makes failure incredibly frowned upon.
Which is happening.
Which is
happening. The more we can change that culture and make it okay to fail, I think is going to take off. And the regulatory system. We can't ban FaceTime and then say we're going to be the innovation hub, right? We have to fix that. So I think there's some responsibility on our part as governments to make the environment as conducive as possible to what we say our objective is.
And watch this space, because the economic stimulus plan that was announced quite recently in Dubai spoke specifically to ensuring that the startup and SME ecosystem was sufficiently robust in order to actually get on with, building and supporting startups. But you're right. I mean, the regulatory framework to date is almost, on a kind of the gig economy, the sharing economy across things like Facebook, FaceTime, and Skype has been sort of anathema to actual advancements across the region. Yes, sir.
If I could just add one thing on the SME sector. I mean, it's worth doing a little bit of digging on this issue. Because, I mean, look, it's well known that small to medium enterprises are the principal drivers of job creation and economic productivity, right? And GDP growth and all that sort of stuff, which is what all these countries have said is their underlying goal. But then if you dig down a little deeper, you'll find that the SMEs that account for the lion's share of that job creation and growth are really not small enterprises, but medium enterprises. In other words, the 50 to 200, 10 million to 50 million to 100 million size enterprise. So for the United States, that's kind of on the small end of medium. But for the region, it's on the big end. It's on the very big end. And the infrastructure to establish and grow that size of business is very rudimentary. It's better for the guy or the gal who wants to, who needs a small amount of money to employ 2 or 3 people, but that's not what's going to transform the region. It's the bigger thing. And what's lacking there is what's lacking in the United States is working capital and capital markets where you can have an ecosystem so that these enterprises can actually expand and grow and become bigger. And that's where I see a real need for adrenaline.
And that's where I think I see, I genuinely believe I think I see policymakers laser focused at present, because there is a massive recognition of that. Yes, sir.
I think you had mentioned that there'd been a lot of Arabs and particularly a lot of Saudis, I think, that had been educated in the U.S. over the last 10, 20 years. I was born in West Virginia. I'm a venture capitalist in California. My experiences in the Gulf have been in the last 5 years, and really kind of changed my perspective on the region. Like, we've done about 50 investments across the MENA region. I'm on the board of a Saudi company that meets quarterly in Dubai. And it's, been a fascinating, change in my perspective on the region and understanding that. I'm wondering if there are any programs to attract more Americans or other people to come to the region. Like, I think there's not very many people who will get on a plane and go to Riyadh or go to Abu Dhabi. Maybe people will get on Emirates and go to Dubai for shopping, but I think you really have to encourage more people to come to the region through cultural programs, through economic incentives, because they just don't know. And
I think that's a fantastically good point on which we will close with your comments, if you will, to that point, and then your closing observations.
You're literally preaching to the choir. There's nothing that I would love more than groups coming in on a daily basis. We get a lot of policy groups and politicians and officials coming all the time. What I'd like to see more of is people going to visit the Louvre, or people going to visit the Opera House, or people coming specifically to sports tournaments or something. It's happening. It's happening. And I'm very grateful to both Emirates and Etihad, who now have a variety of direct flights because it makes that much easier. We in the embassy target certain groups and bring them over. For example, we just had a group of curators and museum experts and collectors to come visit the Louvre. We've just had a delegation from the Special Olympics go back to check out the facility. So it's happening. We do a very good job of trying to attract governors to bring trade delegations from their individual states. I would like to see much more of it. I really think.
More like college students and entrepreneurs, not necessarily just the top end of the society.
That's harder. It's more challenging to bring college students, and I think that's what the goal of NYU was to do, is to be a hub for people to go and spend either a semester or a year or whatever. But when someone's in a 4-year program, it's tough to break them out and break them in. We've tried, and that's why I know it's challenging.
Watch this space. Yes, very briefly.
You have, the ambassador is talking about the government, but also on the private side, you have investors bringing entrepreneurs and into the UAE, for instance. We have our own venture capital investments, and we work with a fund that is based in the US, and it's bringing American investors to the Philippines. We're constantly inviting them to come to the UAE, for instance, meet other like-minded people, etc. So it's both the government and the private sector.
It sounds really basic, doesn't it? But to your point, sir, the fact that you've been in region now for 3 to 4 years and you wish everybody else had got an opportunity to knock back.
That didn't happen until my But no.
We thought you were another millennial in the house.
Let me close on this. When I came here 10 years ago in this job, I had to explain to people the difference between Abu Dhabi and Dubai. And most people hadn't heard of Abu Dhabi. All right, so in 10 years, I see a tremendous amount of progress in just recognition and the number of people that have. How many people here have not been to the UAE?
Yay!
No.
Well done, Ambassador.
I have not run into a lot of people in DC that have not been to the UAE. I mean, it's now a household name, and it's the go-to place in the Middle East, partially because of what else is happening in the Middle East. But in 10 years, in my experience, I've seen a measurable, tangible amount of progress in people who understand what we are doing.
Part of that has been you making friends, sir. Well done, and with the greatest respect to all of you, we're going to have to wind this up because I was told this session was over some time ago. To all of you, thank you very much,
Becky,
particularly
thank you. Becky.
to you. Thank you very much indeed.